Look at you, Idris. Same pathetic, cheap suit. 6 years later, and you're low-level surgeon with zero ambition.
Don't be too hard on Dr. Faraday. Not everyone is cut out for the fast lane. She has no idea. 3 weeks ago, my patent sold for $380 million. Farah, what's going on? Your ex-wife.
And that flashy boyfriend of hers, Desean Okoye.
Look at you, Idris. Still wearing that same pathetic, cheap suit. 6 years later, and you're still just a basic, low-level surgeon with zero ambition. You really are a loser. Adaora's voice cut through the soft, ambient chatter of the St. Regis ballroom like a dull blade. She didn't whisper. She said it loud enough for the circle of socialites around her to pause, their champagne flutes hovering mid-air, their eyes darting between us with a mix of amusement and secondary embarrassment. She was standing under the massive crystal chandeliers of the Houston Memorial Hospital's annual fundraising gala, looking every bit the high-powered hospital chief operating officer she had become. Her crimson bodycon dress hugged her curves perfectly, and her diamonds caught the light with every sharp, practiced movement. Her hand was looped tightly around the arm of Desean Okoye, a man 5 years younger than me who wore a loud, custom-tailored suit with an obnoxious floral pattern. Desean had a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face, looking down his nose at me as if I were a piece of stray lint on his lapel. I didn't flinch. I didn't get angry either. When you spend your days in an operating room reassembling shattered bones and aligning millimeters of titanium inside human flesh, you learn to control your heart rate. You learn that panic is a luxury you can't afford. Instead, I just looked down at my dark navy suit. It wasn't cheap. It was a bespoke Italian cut I'd owned for years, clean, simple, and functional. But to someone like Adaora, who measured a man's worth by the flash of his watch and the speed of his lease rotation, it looked like defeat. "Good evening, Adaora," I said, my voice flat and even. "Desean, is that all you have to say?" Adaora scoffed, shaking her head as she took a slow sip of her champagne. "No defense? No excuses? I guess some things never change. When I walked away from you 6 years ago, my mother told me I was being too harsh. But look at this. You're 39, Idris. You're still doing the exact same shifts, still driving that beat-up sedan, still hiding in your dark little lab. While Desean here is consulting for 3 different regional healthcare networks, you're still just getting by. You never had any vision. You were always content with being ordinary." Desean let out a soft, patronizing chuckle, patting Adaora's hand. "Now, honey, don't be too hard on Dr. Faraday. Not everyone is cut out for the fast lane. The medical world needs foot soldiers, too. Someone's got to actually hold the scalpel while people with real vision build the infrastructure." "Exactly," Adaora said, her eyes flashing with a cold triumph. "I just thank God every day that I didn't waste the rest of my life waiting for you to become someone. You were a drag on my career, Idris. A dead weight." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't feel a single ounce of pain. The woman I had loved for 9 years of marriage had been replaced by this caricature of corporate ambition. What she didn't know, what absolutely no one in this room of wealthy donors, hospital executives, and local politicians knew, was that exactly 3 weeks ago, a multinational medical device conglomerate had quietly finalized an exclusive acquisition. The patent for the smart-locking orthopedic implant system I had spent the last 8 years developing in my private lab had been purchased. The wire transfer had cleared earlier that week. $380 million. Net. I didn't have to work another day in my life. I didn't have to stand on my feet for 12 hours in a chilly operating room, breathing in the scent of bone dust and sterilized steel. I didn't have to answer to hospital administrators who cared more about profit margins than patient outcomes. But I would keep doing it, because I actually cared about the people on my table. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the titanium prototype of the very implant that had made me a multimillionaire, before pulling out my phone. It vibrated against my palm. A text message had just come through. It was from Farah Lucian, an independent medical insurance fraud investigator I had met briefly at a regional orthopedic conference a few months ago. "We need to talk, right now. I'm at the gala. Don't leave before you speak to me. You need to know what's actually happening before this night ends." I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing slightly. Farah was a sharp, no-nonsense investigator known for tearing through complex corporate structures to expose systematic billing fraud. Why was she here, and why was she texting me with such urgency? "Are you even listening to me, Idris?" Adaora's sharp voice snapped me back to the present. She was glaring at me, clearly annoyed that her public humiliation of her ex-husband wasn't producing the desperate, defensive reaction she wanted. "Or are you too busy checking your on-call schedule? Let me guess, a late-night emergency fracture? Someone needs their ankle pinned?" "Just a work-related text," I said quietly, locking my phone and putting it back in my pocket. "I should go. Enjoy your evening." "Run along then," Desean said, offering a mock salute with his champagne glass. "Don't let us keep you from your duties, doctor. We have a meeting with the hospital board members in a few minutes anyway. Big things coming." I turned away from them, the sound of Adaora's light, mocking laughter trailing behind me like a bad odor. As I walked through the crowded ballroom, navigating past groups of Houston's elite, my mind wasn't on her insults. I had spent 6 years processing the end of our marriage. Her calling me a loser was just a reflection of her own insecurities, a desperate need to validate her decision to walk away from a man she thought was standing still. I scanned the edges of the room, looking for Farah. The St. Regis was packed tonight, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, prime rib from the carving stations, and the underlying tension of high society networking. Near the exit leading to the quiet, dimly lit corridor of the hotel's mezzanine level, I spotted her. Farah was leaning against a marble pillar, dressed in a sharp, understated black pantsuit that stood out in a sea of elaborate evening gowns. She had her dark hair pulled back into a tight, professional bun, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk. When her eyes met mine, she gave a single, tight nod and gestured toward the hallway. I followed her, stepping out of the loud, cavernous ballroom and into the carpeted silence of the corridor. The heavy mahogany doors shut behind us, cutting the noise of the jazz band down to a faint, distant hum. "Farah," I said, stepping closer. "What's going on? Your text sounded like an emergency." Farah didn't waste time with small talk. She crossed her arms, her expression dead serious. "Idris, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to keep your head. You're about to be dragged into something very ugly, and if you don't play this right, your name is going to be ruined alongside some very bad people." My heart rate remained steady, but my mind sharpened. "Who?" "Your ex-wife," Farah said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And that flashy boyfriend of hers, Desean Okoye. I've been building a federal case against them for the last 14 months. The silence of the hallway was heavy, but my mind was already pulling backward, drifting to the 9 years I spent building a life with Adaora. It's funny how a decade of shared history can be summarized by a few bitter words under crystal chandeliers. I became an orthopedic surgeon because of a simple belief. A good surgical hand doesn't need to show off. It just needs to be steady enough so no one has to suffer an extra second of unnecessary pain. To me, the most successful surgery isn't the one where the operating room applauds. It's the one where, 5 years down the road, the patient doesn't even remember the surgeon's name because they are completely healthy, walking, and living their life without pain. I carried that exact same philosophy into our marriage. I thought that by quietly doing the heavy lifting, taking the grueling night shifts, managing the house and keeping my head down, I was showing Adaora that I was a reliable partner. I didn't feel the need to boast about every successful procedure or brag about the medical papers I was drafting late at night. I assumed she knew. I assumed she saw the quiet stability I was trying to provide. But Adaora didn't want quiet stability. As her career in hospital administration took off, her appetite for recognition grew insatiable. She climbed the ranks rapidly, eventually becoming the chief operating officer of a prominent private clinic network. Her world became one of boardrooms, public relations, and high society networking. My quiet dedication, which she had once called grounding, slowly began to look like a lack of drive to her. "I need a man who dares to stand in front of the camera and talk about his vision, Idris," she yelled at me during one of our final arguments in our living room. "Not someone who just bows his head in the operating room and is content with being a workhorse. I am building an empire, and you are just holding a scalpel." She didn't want a partner. She wanted a prop. She wanted a flashy, high-profile spouse she could showcase at galas to boost her own corporate brand. Someone who could sell a vision of healthcare innovation, even if they had never actually helped a single patient in their lives. And then came the breaking point, a moment she never fully understood, because I chose to protect her from a truth I thought would break us. 7 years ago, during our 8th year of marriage, my mother, Odette, was diagnosed with severe, degenerative joint disease. She needed an urgent bilateral knee replacement. It was a standard procedure, but because of her pre-existing cardiovascular complications, the specialized post-operative care and specific custom implants required were astronomical in cost. To make matters worse, our family insurance company, the very kind of corporate entity Adaora worked so hard to please, denied the vast majority of the claims. I was faced with a choice. I had spent the previous 2 years quietly funneling every spare cent I earned into my private laboratory in the Texas Medical Center, purchasing the raw titanium alloys, testing equipment, and software licenses needed to develop my smart-locking orthopedic implant. It was my life's work, a design I knew would revolutionize joint surgeries by adjusting to a patient's bone density in real time. But my mother was in constant, agonizing pain. Without hesitation, I emptied my entire private research savings account to cover her surgery and rehabilitation costs. I didn't think twice about it. She was my mother, the woman who had worked 2 jobs to put me through medical school. Because of that decision, my implant research was completely paralyzed for nearly 2 years. I couldn't afford the testing materials, let alone hire laboratory assistants. I had to let the project sit in the dark. And I never told Adaora. I chose not to tell her, because I already knew what her reaction would be. By that point, our marriage was already fracturing under the weight of her ambition. She was already complaining about how long my little lab project was taking, constantly asking when it would finally generate a return on investment. If I told her I had liquidated my research, fund to pay for my mother's medical bills, she wouldn't have seen it as a son's duty. She would have seen it as a massive financial setback, another proof of my lack of ambition and financial foolishness. She would have accused me of throwing away our future for a woman she already viewed as a burden. So I bore the brunt of her disappointment in silence. I let her believe that my research had stalled because I was lazy, or because my design was a failure. I let her call me ordinary. A year later, she demanded a divorce. "You're 33, Idris, and you've hit your ceiling," she told me coldly as she handed me the paperwork. "I can't keep waiting for you to grow up. I need someone who operates on my level." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Orthopedic surgery teaches you when a bone is too shattered to be aligned, and our marriage was beyond repair. I quietly signed the papers, packed my clothes, and walked out of the beautiful co-owned home we had bought in the wealthy River Oaks neighborhood. I left her the house and most of our shared assets, taking only my personal belongings and my locked research files. I moved into a small, sterile apartment near the Texas Medical Center and went back to work. For the next 6 years, while Adaora was busy climbing the social ladder and eventually finding Desean, a man who was a master at selling hollow concepts of medical innovation, I was in my quiet lab. I worked 36-hour hospital shifts, and then I spent my nights under the fluorescent lights of my lab, rebuilding my research from scratch. I refined the smart locking mechanism. I ran thousands of stress test simulations. I didn't care about the fame, the galas, or the applause. I cared about the science. I cared about making an implant that would ensure a grandmother could walk her granddaughter down the aisle without a limp. And then, 3 weeks ago, it happened. Apex Medical Solutions, one of the largest multinational medical device conglomerates in the world, completed their independent clinical review of my prototype. They didn't just want to license it. They wanted exclusive, outright ownership of the patent. When the contract was signed, the acquisition price was set at $380 million. My mother's medical bills had delayed me, but they hadn't stopped me. The quiet work I had done in the dark, the hours of labor that Adaora had ridiculed as the pointless hobby of an ordinary surgeon, had just become one of the most valuable orthopedic patents of the decade. Idris? Farah's voice brought me back to the cold hallway of the St. Regis. Her eyes were searching my face, trying to gauge if I was processing what she was telling me. "Did you hear what I just said?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady as I pulled myself out of the past. "You said Desean and Adaora are involved in federal insurance fraud." "Desean Okoye is the mastermind," Farah corrected, her tone sharp and urgent. "But Adaora's name is all over the operating documents of the Bankston Family Clinic. She signed off on the billing audits. She's the COO, Idris. Whether she was actively stealing or just incredibly blind because she wanted to believe Desean's lies, she is legally responsible, and the feds are stepping in tonight." Farah pulled a sleek, leather-bound notebook from her pocket and tapped the screen of her phone, displaying a flowchart that linked several medical entities in the Houston area. She didn't look like an investigator trying to make a dramatic point. She looked like a surgeon about to perform a clinical dissection. Her eyes were sharp, scanning my face to ensure I was fully absorbing the gravity of her words. 3 years ago, Desean Okoye approached Adaora at a hospital administration conference in Dallas. He presented himself as a medical innovation consultant, a brilliant strategist who could help private clinics maximize their revenue in an increasingly competitive market. Adaora, who had just taken over as the chief operating officer of the Bankston Family Clinic, was hungry to prove herself. She wanted to show her family, and the local medical community, that she could turn their moderately successful practice into a highly profitable empire. I nodded slowly. I knew that hunger. It was the same drive that had made her look at my quiet, methodical research as a waste of time. She wanted results, and she wanted them immediately. Desean pitched her a system he called billing process optimization. He convinced her that private clinics were losing millions every year simply because they didn't know how to navigate the complex, bureaucratic maze of insurance claims. He offered to run his proprietary consulting firm's software through the Bankston Clinic's billing department, promising it would identify underbilled services and legally maximize their insurance payouts. "And let me guess," I said, leaning back against the cool marble pillar. "The optimization wasn't legal at all." "Exactly," Farah said. "Initially, it started small. Desean's consulting firm began adjusting codes for routine orthopedic procedures, upgrading simple consultations to complex, multi-layered diagnostic sessions on paper. But as the revenue started pouring in, and as Adaora began receiving praise from her family's board of directors, Desean pushed the envelope. For the last 2 years, his firm has been helping the Bankston Clinic systematically fabricate hundreds of entirely non-existent treatment cases." The weight of her words settled in the quiet hallway. Falsifying treatment cases wasn't just corporate corner-cutting. It was a major federal crime. "How exactly did they do it without patients noticing?" I asked. "They targeted major corporate insurance policies with high deductibles and automated approval systems," Farah explained, pointing to a column of figures on her screen. "They used real patient identities, people who had visited the Bankston Clinic once or twice for minor issues like a sprained ankle or a physical therapy consultation. Once those patients were in the system, Desean's firm generated fake follow-up appointments, fabricated imaging reports, and billed insurance companies for expensive, long-term rehabilitation treatments that never actually occurred. The patients never saw the bills because they were processed directly through their employer's massive group insurance plans, which rarely audit individual low-tier claims. "And Adaora signed off on this," I murmured, a cold feeling settling in my stomach. Even though she had walked away from me and called me ordinary, she was still the woman I had spent 9 years of my life with. I didn't want to see her ruined. "She didn't just sign off on it, Idris. She is the chief operating officer of the clinic. Legally, every single billing audit and financial statement from the past 2 years bears her signature. She approved the quarterly revenue reports that were directly inflated by these fraudulent claims. Now, here is where it gets even worse. While Adaora believed this was a highly efficient, aggressive business strategy tailored specifically for her clinic, Desean was using her. He used the Bankston Clinic as his primary shield and blueprint to run the exact same insurance fraud ring across 3 other medical facilities in the Houston area." "A shell game," I said, the picture becoming terrifyingly clear. "Precisely," Farah nodded. Desean was the legal owner of the consulting firm, but he set up the corporate structure so that each clinic operated as an independent silo. If one clinic got audited, the liability would fall squarely on that clinic's operational management, meaning Adaora, while Desean could claim his consulting software simply processed the data provided by the clinic staff. He was pocketing a massive 30% consulting fee from the fraudulent payouts, funneling millions of dollars into offshore accounts and luxury assets like his custom suits and sports cars, while leaving Adaora and her family clinic holding the bag. I looked toward the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. Through the glass panels, I could see Adaora standing near the stage, laughing at something a local politician had said. She looked so confident, so utterly convinced of her own brilliance and success. She had no idea she was standing on a landmine that was about to detonate. "Why are you telling me this now, Farah?" I asked, turning my attention back to the investigator. "I'm her ex-husband. We haven't been together for 6 years. If she's guilty of negligence or fraud, that's her battle to fight." Farah looked at me, her expression softening slightly. "Because I know you, Idris. I know the kind of surgeon you are, and I know the integrity behind your smart-locking implant design. When the federal authorities move in tonight, it's going to be a media circus. Desean is going to try to drag everyone down with him to negotiate a plea deal, and Adaora's name is going to be plastered across every local news outlet. I also know that despite everything she did to you, you are a man who cares about the truth. I wanted to give you a heads up, so you aren't blindsided when the storm hits. And frankly, I wanted to make sure your name and your newly acquired patent are completely insulated from any association with the Bankston Clinic." I let out a slow, quiet breath. The patent for my smart-locking implant had been finalized 3 weeks ago, completely independent of the hospital or any private clinic. The $380 million was sitting safely in my bank account, untouched by the chaotic medical corporate world that Adaora had chosen to inhabit. "When is this going down?" I asked. Farah checked her watch. "Tonight, right here. The hospital's board of directors is preparing to introduce Desean Okoye as their new strategic partner for the entire regional clinic network. The feds aren't going to let that happen. They're going to shut it down before he can sign the contract and gain access to public funding." "And Adaora?" "She's about to watch her entire world crumble in front of the very people she spent her life trying to impress," Farah said quietly. "If she truly didn't know about the deeper fraud, she has one chance to save herself. She has to cooperate fully with the federal investigators and turn on Desean the second the handcuffs go on. If she tries to protect him or defend the clinic's billing practices out of pride, she's going to prison." I stood there in the quiet corridor, the distant, upbeat rhythm of the jazz band serving as a bizarre soundtrack to the impending disaster. The woman who had divorced me because she thought I had no vision was about to realize that her own vision had been guided by a parasite. "Thank you, Farah," I said, my voice steady. "I appreciate the warning." Just stay back when the lights go up, Idris, Farah said, giving my shoulder a supportive squeeze before turning to walk back toward the main entrance. The show is about to start. I slipped back into the main ballroom, keeping my distance from the stage and blending into the crowd near the back. The jazz band was wrapping up a lively set, and the hum of conversation in the room had reached its peak. Waiters glided between the tables with fresh trays of champagne, the bubbles catching the warm, golden light of the massive chandeliers. Near the front of the room, standing right by the edge of the stage, Adaora and Desean were the center of attention. Adaora looked radiant, her crimson dress drawing eyes from across the room, her laughter light and melodic as she chatted with several members of the hospital's board of directors. Desean stood beside her, looking incredibly smug in his loud, floral-patterned suit, occasionally checking his gold watch and gesturing toward the stage with an air of supreme importance. He was a man who clearly believed this night belonged to him. Suddenly, the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, signaling the formal portion of the evening was about to begin. The hospital's executive director, a tall, gray-haired man named Dr. Harrison, stepped up to the podium on the stage. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp sound echoing through the cavernous room and drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues and honored guests," Dr. Harrison began, his voice booming through the speakers. "Thank you all for being here tonight for our annual fundraising gala. Every year we gather to celebrate the incredible progress of the Houston Memorial Hospital Network. But tonight, we are also looking toward the future. We are on the cusp of a new era in healthcare delivery, one driven by efficiency, modern technology, and strategic vision." I watched Adaora lean in close to Desean, whispering something in his ear with a bright, proud smile. Desean nodded smoothly, adjusting his lapels. "To help us navigate this future," Dr. Harrison continued, "the hospital's board of directors has been working closely with some of the brightest minds in medical consulting. Tonight, I am absolutely thrilled to introduce our new regional strategic partner. This young man's firm has helped private clinics across the state streamline their billing, optimize their resources, and unlock millions in hidden revenue that can now be reinvested into direct patient care. Please join me in welcoming the founder of Okoye Strategic Solutions, Mr. Desean Okoye." The applause started to rise from the front tables. Desean flashed a brilliant, rehearsed grin, raising a hand to acknowledge the crowd. He took a step toward the stairs of the stage, Adaora watching him with a look of absolute triumph in her eyes. But before Desean's foot could touch the first step, the side door near the stage opened. Farah walked in, her face set in a cold, hard mask. She wasn't alone. Walking directly behind her were two tall, imposing men dressed in matching, dark-suited attire. They didn't look like gala guests. They had the unmistakable, rigid posture of federal law enforcement officers. Farah walked straight to the stage, bypassing the security guards with a calm authority that made them hesitate. She stepped up to the podium, gently but firmly nudging Dr. Harrison aside. The two men in dark suits stepped up with her, one of them taking a position right next to Desean, while the other stood near the stairs, effectively blocking him from moving forward. The applause in the room faltered, then died out completely. A confused, uneasy silence fell over the ballroom. "What is the meaning of this?" "Doctor," Harrison asked, his voice catching in the microphone, projecting his confusion to the entire crowd. "Who are you?" Farah adjusted the microphone, her voice carrying clearly and calmly across the silent room. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Farah, and I am an independent investigator working in coordination with the Office of Inspector General and the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. "I apologize for the interruption," Farah continued, her tone entirely clinical and devoid of emotion. "But before this hospital network signs any strategic partnership agreements, there is an urgent matter of public safety and financial integrity that must be addressed. We are here to present the preliminary findings of a federal investigation into a multi-million-dollar healthcare insurance fraud ring operating right here in Houston." Desean's face went pale, his smug grin instantly vanishing. He took a step back, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors, only to find the federal agent blocking his path. "This is ridiculous," Desean muttered loudly, his voice cracking slightly. "This is a private charity event. You can't just barge in here with these baseless accusations." "These accusations are backed by 12 months of forensic accounting and federal surveillance, Mr. Okoye," Farah said calmly. She nodded to the technician booth at the back of the room. "If you could please turn on the main display." The massive projector screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the hospital's logo and charity donation trackers, flickered and changed. Suddenly, a massive, detailed corporate chart appeared on the screen. It outlined a complex web of shell companies, fake billing logs, and forged patient treatment records. And there, at the very top of the diagram, highlighted in bright, unforgiving red letters, was the name of his firm, Okoye Strategic Solutions. But that wasn't the only name on the screen. As the chart expanded, another prominent entity appeared, linked directly to Desean's firm by a thick red line representing millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. In bold, clear letters, the screen read, "The Bankston Family Clinic." Below it, listed under the title of Chief Operating Officer, was the name Adaora Bankston. The ballroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Adaora stood completely frozen, her face draining of all color. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and sheer terror. Her hand began to shake violently, so much so that her champagne glass rattled against her rings before she hastily placed it down on a nearby table, nearly knocking it over. "As you can see," Farah's voice cut through the silent shock of the crowd, "Okoye Strategic Solutions has been using a systematic upcoding and patient identity theft scheme to bill insurance companies for expensive, non-existent orthopedic rehabilitations. They utilize the infrastructure of several local practices, most notably the Bankston Family Clinic, to run these fraudulent claims through large corporate insurance plans." "This is a mistake!" Adaora cried out, her voice high and desperate, echoing painfully in the quiet room. She looked around at the board members, her colleagues, the people she had spent years trying to impress, but they were all shrinking away from her, their expressions turning cold and disgusted. "I didn't know. I didn't authorize any of this. Desean, tell them this is a mistake." Desean didn't even look at her. He was sweating profusely now, his eyes fixed on the federal agent standing next to him. He tried to force a weak, trembling laugh, looking at Dr. Harrison. "Dr. Harrison, please. This is a misunderstanding. My software, it must have been a system glitch. We can resolve this privately. There's no need for this theater." The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Desean Okoye, you are under arrest for federal healthcare fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As the metal cuffs clicked loudly over Desean's wrists, the reality of the situation finally crashed down on Adaora. She looked like she was about to faint. The glittering world of high society, the prestige, the corporate empire she had sacrificed her marriage to build, all of it was dissolving in front of her eyes in a matter of seconds. In her panic, her eyes frantically scanned the crowd, looking for anyone, any ally who could offer a shred of support. And then she saw me. I was standing at the back of the room, my hands quietly tucked into the pockets of my navy suit, watching the scene unfold without a trace of anger or joy. I was just there. The ordinary, low-level surgeon she had ridiculed and called a loser just minutes ago was the only stable, quiet force in the entire room. Our eyes locked across the cavernous ballroom. In that single, agonizing second, Adaora didn't see a loser. She saw a man who had never lied to her, a man whose integrity was absolute, and a man who was completely untouched by the ruin that was about to consume her. "Dr. Harrison," the second federal agent said, turning to the stunned hospital director, "we will also need to speak with Ms. Bankston and secure all financial and operational records of the Bankston Clinic immediately." Adaora pulled her gaze away from me, her shoulders slumping as she realized she was entirely alone in the wreckage of her own ambition. The humid night air of Houston did nothing to cool the burning tension that lingered after the chaos in the ballroom. I walked out of the St. Regis lobby, leaving behind the hushed whispers of the city's elite, and stepped into the sprawling, dimly lit parking lot. It was nearly midnight, and the concrete expanse was quiet, save for the occasional distant hum of traffic from the highway. I walked toward my reliable silver sedan parked near the edge of the lot, my keys already in my hand. I was just reaching for the door handle when the sharp, frantic click of heels against the pavement shattered the silence. "Idris! Wait! Please, just wait!" I turned around. Adaora was running toward me. The poise and cold confidence she had worn like armor inside the ballroom were entirely gone. Her expensive crimson dress was slightly disheveled at the shoulder. Her dark hair was coming loose from its sleek styling, and the heavy makeup on her face was smudged from tears she had clearly tried to wipe away in a hurry. She looked small, panicked, and incredibly fragile standing under the harsh amber glow of the parking lot light. She stopped a few feet away from me, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, stared at me with a mixture of intense anger, embarrassment, and desperation. "You knew," she gasped out, her voice trembling violently as she pointed a manicured finger at me. "You knew this was going to happen tonight, didn't you?" "I didn't," I said, my voice quiet and calm in the still night air. "Don't lie to me, Idris," she cried, her voice cracking as she took a step closer, her composure completely splintering. I saw you standing at the back of the room. You weren't surprised at all. You just stood there, watching me get destroyed in front of everyone, watching the feds handcuff Desean and drag my family's name through the mud. You knew about the investigation. You knew about Farah. Why didn't you warn me? Why did you let me walk into that ambush?" I looked at her, letting the silence settle between us for a moment. "I met Farah in the hallway exactly 1 hour ago, Adaora. That was the first time I heard anything about Desean's consulting firm, or the fraud at your clinic. I had no idea what was happening until she laid it out for me." "But you could have told me then," she sobbed, tears finally spilling over her lashes and running down her cheeks. "If you found out an hour before, you had time. You could have pulled me aside. You could have warned me before Harrison put Desean on that stage. But you didn't. You wanted to see me fall, didn't you? You wanted to punish me for leaving you, for calling you ordinary, for moving on with my life, while you stayed in the exact same place. I have never wanted to see you ruined, Adaora," I said, my voice steady, though a faint pang of sadness touched my chest. "Not once in the 6 years since we divorced have I wished failure upon you. When Farah told me what was happening, I was deeply concerned for you. I still am. But think about it. If I had walked up to you and Desean in that ballroom, while you were surrounded by board members, and told you your boyfriend was a federal fraud, would you have believed me?" She opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. "You wouldn't have," I continued quietly. "You would have thought I was being a bitter, jealous ex-husband trying to sabotage your big night. You would have told me to leave. And even if you had believed me, the federal agents were already in the building. There was no escaping the reality of what Desean did." Adaora covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking violently, as she let out a choked, desperate sob. The gravity of her situation was fully sinking in. Her boyfriend was in federal custody. Her family's clinic was about to be investigated for multi-million-dollar insurance fraud, and her professional reputation was shattered beyond repair. "He lied to me," she whispered through her fingers, her voice thick with misery. Desean told me it was just optimization. He said every major hospital network did it. I trusted him, Idris. I thought he was a genius. I thought he was the one who was going to help me build something massive. Desean is a salesman, Adaora, I said. He sold you a vision of success because he knew that's exactly what you wanted to buy. He knew you were so hungry for growth and recognition that you wouldn't look too closely at the numbers as long as the revenue kept climbing. And you just stayed in your quiet little corner. She dropped her hands, looking up at me with eyes full of regret. I used to hate that about you. I used to think you were so lazy, so content with being a nobody. When your implant research stalled 7 years ago, I thought it was proof that you had no real talent. I thought you were just using that lab as an excuse to avoid real work. I looked down at the concrete, the memory of those dark, stressful years rushing back. My research didn't stall because I was lazy, Adaora, or because I lacked talent. She wiped her eyes, frowning slightly through her tears. Then why? You spent years working on that smart-locking implant, and then suddenly you just stopped. You wouldn't buy new materials, you wouldn't run tests, you wouldn't even talk about it. You just let it sit there. I thought you had given up because it was too hard for you. My mother needed a bilateral knee replacement, I said, looking back up at her. She had degenerative joint disease. The surgery was complicated by her heart condition, and the custom implants and specialized post-op care she needed cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The insurance company denied almost all of the claims. Adaora stared at me, her breath catching. What? I didn't have that kind of money sitting in our joint accounts, I explained, my voice devoid of anger, just stating the facts of a sacrifice I had made long ago. The only money I had was the private research savings account I had spent years building up to fund my prototype development. So, I emptied it. Every single dollar of it went to pay for my mother's medical bills and her rehabilitation. You paid for her surgery with your research fund? Adaora's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, I nodded. And because of that, I couldn't afford the raw titanium alloys, the software licenses, or the stress testing equipment I needed to keep the project moving. I had to let the research sit in the dark for nearly 2 years, while I worked extra hospital shifts to slowly rebuild that fund from scratch. That's why the project stalled. Why didn't you tell me? She cried, her voice cracking with a new wave of pain. We were married, Idris. Why would you keep something like that from me? Because by that point, our marriage was already failing, I said honestly. You were already complaining that my research was a waste of time and money. If I had told you I threw away all of our savings to fund my mother's surgery, you wouldn't have seen it as a son's duty. You would have seen it as financial recklessness. You would have accused me of throwing away our future for a woman you already saw as a financial burden. I chose to bear the weight of your disappointment, rather than listen to you resent my mother. Adaora took a step back, looking at me as if she were seeing me for the very first time. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The image she had constructed of me over the last 6 years, the image of a lazy, unambitious, ordinary surgeon who had dragged her down, was a complete lie. She had blamed me for standing still, completely unaware that I had sacrificed my own dreams to save my mother's life, all while quietly enduring her contempt. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking as fresh tears streamed down her face. Idris, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I had no idea you did that. It's okay, Adaora, I said quietly, unlocking my car door. It's in the past, but you need to focus on the present now. The feds are going to want answers. If you truly didn't know about Desean's deeper fraud, you need to cooperate with them fully. Don't try to protect him, and don't try to hide anything to save your pride. It's the only way you survive this. She nodded numbly, watching me open the driver's side door. For the first time in her life, the high-flying COO had nothing left to say. The ordinary man she had discarded was the only one offering her a lifeline in the dark. The days following the St. Regis Gala felt like a slow-motion car crash for the Houston medical community. The local news channels had a field day with the story. "Local healthcare reformer arrested at charity gala," the headline screamed, accompanied by footage of Desean Okoye, his head bowed, being led into a police vehicle in his loud floral suit. The Bankston Family Clinic was suddenly thrust into an unforgiving spotlight, its reputation as a prestigious, high-society medical institution tarnished overnight. For Adaora, the nightmare was only beginning. The morning after the gala, federal investigators arrived at the Bankston Clinic with a sweeping search warrant. They carted away boxes of physical files, cloned the hard drives of every administrative computer, and officially sealed the billing department. As chief operating officer, Adaora was immediately summoned to the federal building downtown for questioning. I watched the fallout from a distance, insulated in the quiet sanctuary of my private lab and the sterile operating rooms of Houston Memorial. My legal team, hired immediately after the $380 million acquisition of my smart-locking orthopedic implant patent was finalized, had done their job flawlessly. They ensured that my research, my patent, and my funds were entirely separate from any hospital network or private clinic, including the Bankston Clinic. I was legally untouchable, but I couldn't entirely ignore the storm raging outside. Farah Lucian kept me updated, meeting me for a quick coffee near the Texas Medical Center a week after the arrest. She looked exhausted but satisfied, her sharp eyes reflecting the triumph of a long, difficult investigation. "Desean is in deep trouble, Idris," Farah said, taking a sip of her black coffee. "The prosecutors are preparing a massive indictment. We've uncovered over 40 separate counts of federal healthcare fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy." He was trying to negotiate bail, but the judge denied it. They found evidence of several offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands under shell names. He's classified as a flight risk. He's going to be sitting in a cell until his trial. "And Adaora?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, though the weight of our shared past still lingered in my mind. Farah sighed, leaning forward. "She's terrified, and she has every right to be. Legally, her signature is on every fraudulent quarterly audit from the last 2 years. The federal prosecutors initially wanted to indict her as a co-conspirator. But she took your advice, Idris. She didn't try to hide behind her pride, and she didn't try to protect Desean. The moment she walked into that interrogation room, she laid everything bare. According to Farah, Adaora had spent 3 grueling days in federal custody, undergoing hours of intense questioning. In her panic, she had hired a top-tier criminal defense attorney who laid out her options clearly: either cooperate fully or prepare for a multi-year prison sentence. Adaora chose to cooperate. She granted investigators unrestricted access to her personal computer, her private email servers, and all her communication logs with Desean. The breakthrough came when the forensic team analyzed the specialized billing software Desean's consulting firm had installed at the Bankston Clinic. It turned out Desean had built a back door into the software, while the user interface Adaora saw displayed standard, optimized billing codes that appeared entirely legal. The back end of the system was silently duplicating those claims, attaching fake patient profiles, and routing the inflated invoices directly to corporate insurance providers. Adaora had signed off on the high-level financial summaries, believing they were the result of genuine operational efficiency. She had been completely blinded by her own desperation to prove her vision and worth to her family's board of directors. "Her cooperation is what's saving her from prison," Farah explained. "The forensic evidence confirms she didn't have access to the back-end back door, and there's no record of her receiving any of the offshore kickbacks Desean was funneling. But the professional cost is absolute. She is ruined in this town, Idris." The truth of Farah's words manifested quickly. The Bankston Clinic's board of directors, comprising mostly of Adaora's own family members, moved swiftly to distance themselves from the scandal. They issued a public statement condemning the fraud, stating they had been victims of an external consulting scam, and announced the immediate termination of their chief operating officer. Adaora was forced out of the very empire she had sacrificed her marriage to build. Her family, eager to save their remaining business assets and avoid further scrutiny, made her the scapegoat. They cut her off financially, revoked her administrative privileges, and asked her to step down from all community boards. Her wealthy socialite friends, the very people she had laughed with under the crystal chandeliers of the St. Regis, stopped answering her calls. She went from being one of the most powerful women in Houston healthcare to a social pariah in a matter of weeks. I ran into her about a month later. I was leaving a legal consultation near the courthouse downtown when I saw her coming out of the federal building. She was dressed in a simple, dark gray suit, her hair pulled back, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. She had lost weight, and the sharp, aggressive edge she once had was gone, replaced by a quiet, subdued exhaustion. She saw me and stopped. For a moment, I thought she might turn away, but instead, she took a deep breath and walked over to me. "Hello, Idris," she said softly. Her voice didn't have the biting sarcasm or the cold authority of our past meetings. It was just tired. "Adaora," I nodded. "How are you holding up?" She let out a dry, humorless chuckle, looking up at the gray Houston sky. "I'm surviving, I guess. My lawyers tell me the prosecutors are officially dropping the conspiracy charges against me in exchange for my testimony at Desean's trial. I won't go to prison, but everything else is gone. The clinic, my reputation, my family's trust. I had to sell my house in River Oaks just to cover the legal retainers." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. "Don't be," she said, looking me in the eye. "It's the price of my own stupidity. I wanted so badly to believe I was a visionary, Idris. I wanted to believe I was building an empire, and I was so arrogant that I couldn't see I was just a pawn in someone else's game. You were right. Desean was a salesman, and I was his easiest target." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of my face. "I heard about your patent, by the way. It was in the National Medical Journals last week. Apex Medical Solutions purchased your smart locking implant design. $380 million. The article called it one of the most innovative orthopedic advancements of the decade." I didn't boast. I didn't smile. It was just the result of 8 years of quiet work at Adaora. I just wanted to build something that worked. "I know," she whispered, her eyes filling with a familiar, painful regret. "You wanted to build something that worked. I wanted to build something that looked good. That was always the difference between us, wasn't it? I called you ordinary, Idris. But the truth is, I was the ordinary one. I was just loud about it." She didn't wait for me to reply. She gave me a small, sad nod, turned and walked down the concrete steps toward the street, disappearing into the crowded Houston sidewalk. I stood there, watching her go, realizing that the final chapter of our past was truly closed. The legal system was dismantling the lies, and the truth had finally found its way home. 6 months passed, like a quiet, steady breath after a violent storm. In the medical circles of Houston, the scandal that had once dominated every dinner party and board meeting gradually faded into a cautionary tale. The legal machinery of the federal government, however, moved with an uncompromising, slow precision. Desean Okoye's high-flying lifestyle came to an absolute, crushing halt. The federal prosecutors didn't show him an ounce of leniency. Backed by the forensic accounting reports, the cloned hard drives from the Bankston Clinic, and the undeniable evidence of his offshore Cayman Islands accounts, they hit him with a massive indictment of over 40 separate counts of federal healthcare fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. His flashy floral suits were replaced by a standard, sterile orange jumpsuit. With his bail denied due to him being deemed a flight risk, Desean sat in a federal holding facility, watching his legal defense team slowly dissolve as his funds were frozen by the court. His trial was set, and according to Farah Lucien, he was facing a substantial prison sentence in a federal penitentiary. The man who had built an empire on hollow visions had finally run out of things to sell. Adaora managed to avoid a prison cell, but the cost of her freedom was the complete dismantling of the life she had spent a decade constructing. Because she had chosen to cooperate immediately and fully with the authorities, and because the forensic investigation proved she had no knowledge of or access to the software's fraudulent back-end, the prosecutors officially spared her from conspiracy charges. But she wasn't spared from the devastation. She was forced to resign immediately from her position as chief operating officer of the Bankston Family Clinic. Her family, terrified of being dragged further into the federal mud, offered her no support. They treated her like a liability, cutting her off from the family assets and removing her name from every board of directors. To pay her mounting legal fees, Adaora had to sell her beloved luxury home in River Oaks. She traded the sprawling, high-security mansion for a modest, two-bedroom apartment on the quieter, less fashionable side of the city. But the most significant change in Adaora's life wasn't where she lived, but how she lived. Deprived of her high society titles and the corporate prestige she had once craved, she had to find a job. No major private healthcare network in Houston would touch her. Her name was still too closely associated with the St. Regis scandal. Left with no other options, she took a position as an administrative coordinator at a small, nonprofit community health clinic in a working-class neighborhood, starting her career over in a much more transparent healthcare environment. It was a grueling, unglamorous job. There were no crystal chandeliers, no corporate bonuses, and no luxury catering. Instead, she spent her days dealing with real, human problems, helping low-income families navigate basic healthcare forms, organizing free vaccination drives, and managing tight, transparent budgets where every dollar had to be accounted for. For the first time in her career, Adaora wasn't looking at patients as data points or revenue optimization opportunities. She had to look them in the eye, listen to their struggles, and help them find actual care. The work was demanding, but it was honest. Slowly, the hard, defensive shell she had worn for years began to soften. She was learning to build a life from the ground up, without the props of wealth and status. My own life, by contrast, had changed dramatically in scope, but barely at all in routine. When the $380 million from the patent acquisition cleared into my accounts, I didn't rush out to buy a fleet of sports cars or a penthouse overlooking the Gulf. I didn't quit my job at Houston Memorial either. I still woke up at 5 in the morning, still wore my comfortable, well-worn scrubs, and still stood on my feet for hours in the operating room. To me, the money wasn't a ticket to escape the medical world. It was a tool to protect it. The first thing I did with my new wealth was secure my mother's future. Odette Faraday was now 66, and thanks to the bilateral knee replacement surgeries I had funded years ago, she was walking without a trace of pain. She could tend to her garden, walk through the neighborhood park, and live her life with the physical freedom she had earned. I bought her a beautiful, quiet cottage close to my apartment, a place with a wraparound porch where she could sit and read in the evenings. "I'm proud of you, Idris," she told me one evening as we sat on her new porch, watching the sunset. "Not because of the money, but because you didn't let the money change the boy who wanted to fix people's bones." "I learned how to stay grounded from you, Mom," I said, holding her hand. But my biggest project was yet to come. I wanted to ensure that no other young, passionate medical student or researcher would have to go through the grueling, desperate choices I had faced 7 years ago. I didn't want another brilliant design to sit in a dark lab for years because a student had to choose between funding their research and saving their parents' life. Working quietly with my legal team and the administration at the Texas Medical Center, I established the Odette Faraday Medical Scholarship and Research Fund, naming the scholarship after my supportive mother. I seeded the foundation with a significant portion of my patent acquisition earnings. The mission of the fund was simple and direct. It provided full, unrestricted tuition scholarships to medical students from working-class backgrounds, and it offered independent research grants to young medical innovators who lacked the corporate backing to develop their ideas. I set up the selection committee to prioritize students who showed a genuine commitment to patient care and hands-on medicine, rather than those who simply wanted to climb the corporate ladder. I wanted to find the quiet ones, the ones who were willing to do the heavy lifting in the dark without demanding applause. On a chilly Tuesday morning in early November, the Texas Medical Center officially announced the launch of the foundation. The press release was simple, focusing entirely on the legacy of my mother and the opportunities the fund would create for future generations of doctors. There were no grand galas, no flashy media campaigns, and no self-aggrandizing speeches. Just a clean, straightforward announcement of a resource that would help heal people for decades to come. I stood in my office at the hospital, looking out the window at the vast medical complex. Underneath the gray autumn sky, thousands of patients, doctors, and nurses were moving between the buildings, each carrying their own burdens, their own hopes, and their own pain. I knew that my smart locking implant was already being used in surgeries across the country, helping thousands of people walk again, without pain. And now, the scholarship fund would help ensure that more hands would be trained to do that work. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against my phone. I had no texts from corporate executives or high society promoters, and that was exactly how I liked it. I was just Dr. Idris Faraday, a surgeon who had done what he set out to do. The ordinary life I had chosen to live was now the foundation for something extraordinary. The last week of December brought a rare, crisp chill to Houston, clearing the humid haze that usually hung over the city. Inside the main wing of Houston Memorial Hospital, the atmosphere was quiet, decorated with simple pine wreaths and soft white lights for the holidays. Most of the administrative staff had already gone home for the holidays, leaving the wide, polished corridors peaceful. I had just stepped out of the locker room, having changed out of my scrubs and into my dark navy suit. I had spent the last 4 hours in the operating room, performing a complex reconstructive surgery on a young construction worker who had shattered his tibia. The surgery had been a complete success. Using the smart locking implant system I had designed, we were able to stabilize the bone perfectly without risking any long-term alignment issues. The kid would walk again, cleanly and without a limp, in a matter of months. As I walked down the long, carpeted corridor of the administrative wing, my mind was at ease. The Odette Faraday Foundation had officially completed its first round of scholarship distributions, funding the entire medical school education of 12 incredibly talented students from working-class neighborhoods. Everything was moving exactly the way it was supposed to. I was approaching the central lobby when I saw a woman standing near the large floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights. She wore a simple, charcoal-colored wool coat, her hair styled in a neat, unassuming ponytail. There were no flashing diamonds on her fingers, no high-end designer bags draped over her shoulder, and no sharp, aggressive posture. She held a thick paper folder in her hands, her shoulders relaxed, looking quietly contemplative. It was Adaora. I stopped for a split second, then continued walking. My footsteps on the polished floor caught her attention, and she turned her head. When our eyes met, she didn't flinch, and she didn't try to look busy. A soft, genuine smile touched her lips, a smile I hadn't seen on her face in almost a decade. "Idris," she said, her voice quiet and steady. "I hoped I might run into you before I left." "Adaora," I nodded, walking over to join her by the window. "What brings you to Memorial? I thought you were working on the east side now." "I am," she said, gesturing to the paper folder in her hands, which bore the logo of the East End Community Health Clinic. "But we've been trying to coordinate a new patient referral partnership. A lot of our low-income patients need specialized orthopedic and cardiac care that our little clinic simply can't provide. I was here to submit our proposal to the hospital's community outreach board." "That's a tough board to crack," I noted gently. "They're usually very tight with their budget." "They are," she agreed, letting out a soft, dry laugh. 6 months ago, I would have walked into that boardroom demanding a meeting, throwing around titles and trying to bulldoze my way through the bureaucracy. Today, I just submitted the paperwork, explained the actual human need behind the numbers, and told them we'd be grateful for whatever support they could offer. It's funny how much easier things are when you stop trying to perform. I looked at her, realizing how much she had changed. The sharp, guarded look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, mature clarity. The ruin of her old lifestyle had stripped away the vanity, leaving behind the intelligent, capable woman I had once fallen in love with. "How is the new job?" I asked. "It's hard," she said honestly, looking back out at the glowing skyline. "The hours are long, the pay is barely a fraction of what I used to make, and we are constantly fighting for resources. But, for the first time in my life, I actually know my patients' names. I know their kids. I know their stories. I'm not just optimizing spreadsheets or maximizing insurance claims anymore, Idris. I'm actually helping people. It's exhausting, but when I go to sleep at night, I don't feel like I'm wearing a mask." "I'm glad to hear that, Adaora," I said, and the sincerity in my voice was absolute. "You were always brilliant at operations. You just needed to find the right place to put that energy." "Thank you," she whispered. She paused, looking down at the folder in her hands before looking back up at me. "I saw the news about the Odette Faraday Foundation. 12 full scholarships in the first month. It's incredible, Idris. Your mother must be so incredibly proud." "She is," I smiled. "She actually helped select the final candidates. She wanted to make sure we chose people who cared about the hands-on work, not just the prestige." Adaora nodded slowly, a faint, melancholic look passing through her eyes. "You know, when we were married, I used to think you were hiding from the world in that little lab. I thought you were afraid of the spotlight, afraid of taking risks. I was so obsessed with the idea of a visionary husband who would help me climb the social ladder that I completely missed the fact that you were quietly building something that would actually change lives." "I wasn't hiding, Adaora," I said quietly. "I just didn't see the point in talking about a building before the foundation was even poured. A doctor's real vision isn't something you sell to a crowd. It's what you quietly build in the dark, when no one is watching, simply because it needs to be built." "I understand that now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I had to lose everything to finally understand it. I spent years calling you ordinary, Idris. But the truth is, I was the one who was ordinary. I was just loud about it, because I was terrified of being forgotten." "We were both young, and we wanted different things," I said, offering her a quiet sense of peace. "You don't need to carry that guilt anymore. You're doing honest, important work now. That's what matters." "Actually," Adaora said, a sudden spark of professional focus returning to her eyes, "there's something I wanted to ask you. Professional, of course. The East End Clinic has been seeing a massive influx of elderly patients with severe degenerative joint disease. They can't afford standard joint replacements, and most of them don't qualify for traditional private insurance. I know the Odette Faraday Fund is focused on research and education, but do you think there's any room for a community clinic partnership?" I looked at her, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "As a matter of fact, yes. We've been looking for a reliable community partner to launch a free orthopedic clinic program. If your facility has the space, the foundation can fund the equipment and supply the smart locking implants. I can personally volunteer to perform the surgeries here at Memorial." Adaora's eyes went wide, a look of pure, unadulterated gratitude washing over her face. "Are you serious, Idris? You would do that for us?" "I would do it for the patients, Adaora," I said. "But yes, I'd be happy to work with you on this. You write up the operational plan, and I'll have my legal team approve the funding." "I'll have it on your desk by Monday morning," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "No shortcuts, no inflated numbers, just the honest facts." "I expect nothing less," I nodded. We stood there by the window for a few more minutes, watching the quiet winter night settle over Houston. For the first time in 6 years, We weren't talking as bitter ex-spouses, and we weren't trying to play the roles we had constructed for ourselves. We were just two major people, shaped by our sacrifices and our mistakes, finding a common ground where we could do some good in the world. As Adaora turned to leave, she paused, looking back at me one last time. "Goodbye, Dr. Faraday." "Goodbye, Adaora," I said. I watched her walk down the long, quiet corridor, her head held high, her steps steady and purposeful. The truth had finally found its way home. She had lost her empire, but she had found her soul, and I had kept my promise to my mother, to my patients, and to myself. A man's true vision does not lie in how he speaks of himself before the crowd, but in what he quietly builds when no one is watching. And the truth, in the end, always finds its way home just when it needs to be seen.